It's the lifelong human rights campaigner, Peter Tatchell. And we originally wanted to speak to Peter because we're approaching the end of LGBT History Month, and Peter's been at the forefront of many of the hard-won victories we've seen for gay people. In recent years, it's been easy to think of this month as a month of reflection, where we can look back and remember the injustices faced, the progress made, and the rate of pace and change. And also where we can look in hope to a future in which more people are treated more fairly than they ever have been. And that's exactly what we had wanted to discuss with Peter. His campaigning credentials date way back to his school days in Australia, to the Gay Liberation Front in the 1970s in London, and to Moscow in the noughties. But this year, we don't need to look to the past to see human rights being infringed across the world, and we don't need to look to history to see injustices faced by gay people in Russia and Belarus and in other places in Eastern Europe today. And we've also just seen, as you've heard throughout the programme, a major invasion of a sovereign European state by a global power which has made no secret of its intolerance of the LGBT community. So what does this mean for people in Eastern Europe who are fighting for their human rights? And what should countries like ours do to help them? Peter, first of all, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
My honour. Great to join you.
Thank you. And you were there at the very first gay pride in Moscow. Explain to me what the atmosphere in Soviet Russia is like towards LGBT community, and how you fear it has got better or worse in the time since.
Well, this was in 2006 when Russian activists tried for the first time to hold a gay pride parade in Moscow. The right to protest is enshrined in the Russian constitution and law, but the then mayor of Moscow banned the gay pride parade. So I was invited to go there to support the very brave, courageous Russian activists. And what happened was, as soon as we assembled, we were set upon by a combination of riot police and neo-Nazis, many of whom were operating in collusion with the Moscow police and the riot squad. Many of us were beaten up. I eventually managed to escape, but quite a lot of people were arrested and very, very roughly treated by the police. And those who were set upon by neo-Nazis had a whole series of horrific injuries. And I've got to tell you, the Moscow police did nothing to intervene to protect those victims of neo-Nazi attack.
And when you look at some of the protests you've been on around the world, when you look at the progress that's been made, I mean, that's maybe later than a lot of other countries, but it's not a story that we've not heard told before.
Well, you're right. I mean, in the period after the fall of the Soviet Union, the LGBT plus movement in Russia did have a period of freedom or relative freedom. You know, they were interviewed on state TV, they formed organizations, they held some protests and cultural events. But when Putin came to power, things began to slide in reverse. And that wasn't just against the LGBT plus community, but against the whole of civil society, against trade unions, women's organizations, political oppositionists, and those campaigning for minority ethnic rights. They all suffered the cosh of Putin's regime. And I have to say, in the context of the current Russian invasion of Ukraine, I warned 20 years ago that the Russian military was being restructured away from defensive weaponry and troop deployments to an offensive long-range capacity. Long-range strategic bombers, like we've seen used by Russia to bomb civilian cities in Syria, long-range ships and aircraft carriers capable of military exercises and military operations thousands of miles from Russia. Now, this was all the warning signs that Russia had potential aggressive intentions. And it was compounded at least 10 or 15 years ago when Putin made it very clear that he wanted the restoration of the old Soviet Union, that he had this vision of a greater Russia. And I'm just so shocked and appalled that the international community, including Western nations, ignored those warning signs. They allowed the annexation of Crimea in 2014. They allowed before that the Russian intervention in Georgia. So all along, the West has given a green light to Putin that he can act with impunity. And we are now paying a terrible price or the Ukrainian people are paying a terrible price for that inaction and that neglect of Putin's capability and intention.
Well, that's you talking about his expansionist tendencies abroad, but there's also been a ratcheting of restrictions at home. And I wonder if you, like me, have actually been quite affected by the immense bravery that we've seen on the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg and some other cities in Russia, where individual people are standing up and saying, the government of our country is not the only voice in our country, and we disagree with what they're doing here.
Yes, those protests are inspirational, but of course, they are very much a minority. Putin has pretty much complete control of the media. Certainly, state TV, all the TV stations are now under Putin's control. So the vast majority of Russian people only get the regime's propaganda. They don't know what's really going on. They are fed these lies about Nazis in Ukraine. And it makes me laugh because, as I said, when I went to Moscow, the Moscow authorities colluded with neo-Nazis in Moscow to allow me and Russian LGBT activists to be beaten up. So who are they to talk about other countries tolerating neo-Nazis? The Russians are some of the worst tolerators of far-right extremists.
Well, I think if we're looking at the current dispute, we're also going to see a large number of displaced people. Some of them are going to be internally displaced within Ukraine, but other people are going to move between countries as refugees. Do you think that we have a responsibility to give LGBT refugees priority here because of the way in which they face treatment if they stay?
Well, as you probably know, there has been information released by the United States which suggests that Putin has drawn up a plan, basically a kill and detain list of people in Ukraine. So these are political leaders, social activists, journalists, lawyers, human rights defenders, and LGBT plus people. These are people who are going to be marked to be rounded up, detained, and in some cases killed. Now, that is very much par for the course. It's what we saw happen in Crimea to some extent, and it is what we have seen happen in the Donbass region in the two newly self-declared independent states, which Russia has control over. So I would say that all countries around the world have a duty under the Refugee Convention of 1951, which they've signed and pledged to uphold, to accept refugees, not just LGBT plus refugees, but any genuine refugees who are in danger of persecution, including detention without trial, torture, and even possible execution. It is our duty to do something, not just to wring our hands and condemn. We have to act. And I've got to say that Britain's record is very, very poor. After the fall of the Taliban, after the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban, Britain promised that it would help evacuate LGBT plus refugees from that country. So far, only 29 LGBT refugees from Afghanistan have been accepted as refugees in Britain, when LGBT activists in Afghanistan have a list of over 800 LGBT plus people who are at severe risk of detention without trial, torture, and even execution. I have now, working with Afghan LGBT activists, I presented a list of an initial 100 LGBT people from Afghanistan to Lord Herbert, the government's LGBT envoy, and he is now considering whether the government can facilitate refuge for them. But I think it's taken so long. You know, the Taliban took over, close to a year ago. Close to a year ago. So, people are living in fear, and some have already been arrested, tortured, and in some cases killed. There are 800 we know of, over 800 we know of, in hiding, fearing for their lives.
Well, I am keen to get on to talk about Britain and the UK. And you came here from Australia in 1971. You were part of the Gay Liberation Front until it collapsed in 1974. And the environment then to now, I think, I'm 43. We've all got tragic coming out stories, but it's nothing like, the kind of shoulders of giants that we all stood on years ago, and the work that you guys did to make it so much easier for us and the generations that have come after. Where do you see some of those advances being rolled back, if you see some of those advances being rolled back? And could you even imagine in the 1970s that we would have things like equal marriage, that we would have just the difference in terms of openness that we have now?
Well, I can remember in 1969, at the age of 17, based on the history and experience of the Black Civil Rights Movement in America, calculating it would probably take about 50 years to win legal equality for LGBT plus people in Western countries like Australia, Britain, and the United States. Now, that was a guesstimate, but it's almost turned out right. Basically, we do now have formal legal equality, and it's within that 50-year time frame. I don't think there's so much a danger of rolling things back, but certainly progress has been stalled. As we know, the government promised to outlaw conversion therapy, the attempt to make gay people straight, nearly 4 years ago, and we're still waiting. The government had a consultation about easing the legal process for trans people, even though the vast majority of people who responded to that consultation agreed that they should have that easing of restrictions. Still, the government has said no. And of course, the wider issue of LGBT plus refugees fleeing persecution, whether it be Ukraine or Russia or Iran, Saudi Arabia, Uganda, Nigeria, many of them wait years for their cases to be adjudicated on. Some of them end up being detained in prison-like conditions in asylum detention centers for 6 months, a year, 2 years. And these people are not criminals. They are victims of criminal regimes. They've often been beaten, arrested, jailed, and tortured, and they come here and seek refuge, and our government puts them in a prison-like situation. That is just so wrong. You
just said you just spoken to Nick Herbert, the LGBT envoy, on the issue of LGBT refugees from Afghanistan. Presumably, you have an open and ongoing dialogue with him about this and other issues too, because it's still the government's commitment in order to ban conversion therapy.
Yes, I mean, the government is still committed, but it's taken so long. There was a consultation yonks ago, and the government was then, under Theresa May, ready to move forward very swiftly. But since then, it's just been stalled and stalled and stalled. Now, I'm still hopeful it will happen, but for heaven's sake, why are we waiting so long? And while we are waiting, people are still being subjected to these horrendous, unethical, harmful practices which seek to convert them to being heterosexual, when that is completely against their nature. And, most of those people suffer incredible depression, anxiety. Some even have suicidal thoughts, and a few have actually committed or attempted suicide. So it's so wrong that we keep waiting for this.
Well, one of the things I want to talk about is the political changes that have happened as well. You stood for election in a by-election in Bermondsey in 1981, and some of the
83.
things. 83. My apologies. I was 4. I wasn't 2. But I've looked back at some of what happened then and some of the reportage from the time, and some of the stuff that was said. I mean, it was pretty gritty stuff, and even the kind of nudge, wink, wink of it. It's a straight choice, all that sort of stuff. I mean, could you then, when you were taking all that incoming fire, could you see a place where you could have, Conservative cabinet ministers, never mind Labour ones, that were openly gay? You could have somebody like me 10 years ago becoming a political leader in Scotland, without actually that much being said about my sexuality, really, more by the media than by people within the party. I mean, I felt certainly that we did hit a turning point a few years ago. Now, I worry sometimes that we're not keeping up that momentum, but I do feel as if there has been change in this country. Oh,
absolutely. The change has been phenomenal. And I always had the long-term vision. I was in it for the long haul. At 17, I said, it'll take 50 years. I'm going to be part of that. And I've stuck at it ever since. And, you're right. I mean, you think back to 1999, and in that year, up until that year, Britain had by volume the largest number of anti-LGBT laws of any country in the world, some of them dating back centuries. Yet, just 13 years later, with the legalization of same-sex marriage in 2013, we had some of the best laws. Now, that has got to be probably the fastest, most successful law reform campaign in British history. And I want to take this opportunity to thank all the unsung, unknown LGBT plus people who lobbied their members of parliament, who marched in the streets. And of course, I want to thank our straight friends and allies. Without your support, we couldn't have done it. So thank you so, so much.
And where's next? Because there is still a large number of people that suffer homophobic abuse, that are targeted through hate crime, that feel that they aren't able to access services in the same way, that aren't able to access justice in the same way. Where do you think that the next fight is that you're going to take on?
Well, it certainly is true that according to the most recent survey, about half of all LGBT plus kids in schools have been victims of bullying. Half of them. And that's really shocking. That's a form of child abuse. On our streets, a third of all LGBT plus people in this country have been victims of homophobic, biphobic, or transphobic hate crime. And for older people, they've often been victims not once, but 2, 3, or even 4 times. So there is still work to be done. But I think the real front line for LGBT plus rights is global. There are still 69 countries that criminalize same-sex relations. 12 have the death penalty. Of these countries, 35 are members of the Commonwealth in defiance of the Commonwealth Charter, which pledges equal treatment and non-discrimination for all Commonwealth citizens. And of those 35 Commonwealth countries, 8 still have the maximum penalty of life imprisonment for being gay. This is just unconscionable in the 21st century.